This Alonzo is, he's confused. He's twisted. But I don't look at him as a bad guy, really. He just, he's got problems.
He's a guy that's probably done some good when he first started and realized that, you know, if you just move this an inch this way, you can actually get a case to stick. Foot in a yard, and next thing you know, you're on the other side.
If you've seen Training Day, then you definitely remember Alonzo Harris, the ruthless, crooked cop who ran the streets like a gangster. Now, Alonzo might have been a wild character, but believe it or not, the real-life inspiration behind him, Rafael Perez, was even more shocking.
Former cop Rafael Perez, charged with stealing and selling 8 pounds of in 1998, Perez has implicated himself and other officers.
Perez wasn't just dirty. He was out there stealing drugs, setting people up, and pretty much became the face of LAPD's biggest scandals. So when Denzel Washington stepped into the role of Alonzo Harris, basically playing Rafael, it felt way too real. He made it look like he had actually lived that life. But let's be honest, Denzel's as far from a real gangster as it gets. But it wasn't just Alonzo making Training Day feel real, some of the other characters brought serious authenticity too. Take Paul, one of Alonzo's right-hand men, played by none other than Dr. Dre.
What up, killer?
I can't call it. What's up with you?
Did I talk to the three wise men? Everything is lovely.
If you know anything about Dre's past, you know he wasn't just rapping about the streets. He lived through the chaos of the East Coast versus West Coast wars. Then there's Blue, the drug dealer in the wheelchair, played by none other than West Coast legend Snoop Dogg.
What you need, homie?
Crack. 20 bucks?
Crack.
Yeah.
And let's be real, Snoop wasn't just acting. His ties to the Rollin' 20s Crips made his role hit way harder. And what about that gang member who pulled a gun on Alonzo?
Go ahead and bounce on me. Get up out of here. We got your back.
That was CLE Bone Shaheed Sloan, a real-life, now inactive blood. He's the same guy who got caught up in the whole Suge Knight hit-and-run incident that left Heavyweight Records co-founder Terry Carter dead. But here's the craziest part. Some of the gangsters in Training Day weren't actors at all. They were real gang members pulled straight from the streets while the movie was being filmed.
The gang members are the guys that gave me permission to come into their neighborhoods. They were so supportive. And I wanted them to be in the movie. These guys got real scars, real bullet holes. They deal with these cops every day.
That's next-level authenticity. And speaking of crazy details, remember Alonzo's 1979 Chevy Monte Carlo? That license plate, ORP 967, wasn't just some random mix of letters and numbers. Turns out it was a sneaky nod to Officer Rafael Perez, who was born in '67. Talk about hidden clues. Anyway, while all of this added to the movie's success, there's still so much people don't know about the real Rafael Perez. Let's get into it. Born in Puerto Rico on August 22, 1967, Perez moved to Philadelphia with his mom when he was still a kid. Growing up, he was obsessed with cop shows and movies about the LAPD. He wanted to be one of those guys, the heroes taking down criminals and making the streets safer. After high school, he joined the Marines. He wasn't the most popular guy, but those who knew him said he was friendly, easygoing, and always willing to help. While in the military, he got married young, but things didn't go as planned. In 1998, the base he was stationed at in Maine shut down, so he and his wife packed up and moved to California for a fresh start. He was only 21 at the time, but that fresh start didn't last long. Not long after the move, Perez got caught cheating with another Marine, and his marriage fell apart. By the end of the year, he was divorced. Even with his personal life in shambles, he still had his childhood dream, becoming a cop. He took the LAPD entrance exam, passed, and made it into the police academy. He didn't just get through it, he crushed it, becoming the squad leader of his class. By 1989, at just 22 years old, Rafael Perez was officially a Los Angeles police officer. At first, he was on the straight and narrow. After his rookie year, he started working undercover in the LAPD's narcotics division. It was high-stakes, fast-paced work, and he had a natural talent for it. He was partnered with David Mack, a cop from Compton who had joined a year earlier. Together, they worked on the buy and bust team, going undercover, buying drugs, and making arrests. This was where Perez got a first-hand look at LA's underworld. He learned how the drug trade operated, saw how gangs controlled entire neighborhoods, and witnessed the damage drugs did to the communities he patrolled. Determined to make a difference, he threw himself into the job, taking down drug dealers and gang members left and right, and for a while, he was a model cop. His superiors loved him. He made big arrests, kept his record clean, and had a reputation for doing things by the book. No reports of misconduct, no complaints. Just a young cop making a name for himself. Then came 1993. That's when everything changed. Perez and his partner, David Mack, were involved in a fatal shooting. According to them, a drug dealer pulled a gun on Perez, forcing Mack to shoot first to save his partner's life. That's the story they told. But witnesses had a different version. They claimed the dealer wasn't even armed. They said he was shot once when he approached the police car, then tried to run, only to be shot again in the back, which offed him. Two completely different stories, and the tension around what really happened started to build. Despite the controversy, the department backed them up. Their official report said the shooting was justified, and there was no wrongdoing. Not only were they cleared, but David Mack was even given a medal for heroism, credited with saving Perez's life. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But this was just the beginning of a much darker road, one that would take Perez from being a rising star in the LAPD to one of the most infamous corrupt cops in history. By 1995, Rafael Perez had built a solid reputation as a cop who got results, and his reward, a spot in the elite Rampart Crash Unit, an undercover division that was all about taking down LA's gang problem. Crash stood for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, and their job was simple: track gang activity, gather intel, and keep the streets in check. Rampart, a dense neighborhood west of downtown LA, was crawling with at least 30 different gangs, making it the perfect battleground for someone like Perez. Unlike regular cops, Crash officers didn't wear uniforms. They dressed in plain clothes, blending in with the neighborhoods they patrolled. By this point, Perez was no longer partnered with David Mack. He had a new teammate, and together they hit the streets with a mission. But for Perez, this was more than just undercover work. He started dressing and acting more like a gangster than a cop, demanding respect from everyone he encountered. And if they didn't comply, there were consequences. His Puerto Rican roots gave him an edge. Most people assumed he was black, but he spoke fluent Spanish, which meant gang members and drug dealers who didn't know his background often let their guard down around him. They spilled secrets, gave up information, and unknowingly helped him build his own power on the streets. It didn't take long for Perez to go rogue. His first step into corruption happened fast. During a big drug bust, he and his partners seized a dealer's cash, but instead of turning it all in as evidence, they skimmed some off the top. Just like that, the downward spiral began. Soon, he wasn't just pocketing money. He was stealing drugs straight from criminals, using illegal searches, planting fake evidence, and setting people up for crimes they never committed. 2 gang members were sentenced to years in prison after Perez planted weapons on them. Their protests meant nothing. Because of their records, no one believed them. And with his reputation as a top cop, no one ever questioned Perez's arrests. With all the money rolling in, Perez started living large. He got remarried, moved into a fancy house in LA, and his neighbors couldn't help but notice his ever-growing collection of new cars and expensive home upgrades. His secret? He was running a side hustle, dealing stolen drugs. He'd lift narcotics from dealers, then pass them to his girlfriends to sell on the streets. But street-level drug dealing wasn't enough. Perez wanted more. He started stealing from the police department's own evidence lockers, replacing real coke with flour or Bisquick mix to cover his tracks. He was building his own empire, and through his old partner David Mack, he found himself connected to some of the biggest players in the game. Mack introduced Perez to Suge Knight, who was looking for off-duty cops as security. Perez was all in, working for death row on his days off while still rocking an LAPD badge. By early 1998, he wasn't even trying to play the good cop. He was partying non-stop, drinking, throwing wild hotel bashes with exotic dancers, sometimes while still on duty. And when it came to suspects, he had no problem pulling the trigger, even refusing to get them medical help. One victim ended up paralyzed and sentenced to 23 years in prison. Perez got so reckless that he stopped covering his tracks, and that's what brought him down. Even before his world collapsed, LAPD was already buzzing with rumors and quiet investigations. One major red flag: the suspicious death of another cop, Kevin Gaines. It all went down on March 18, 1997. Officer Frank Liga, an undercover narcotics cop with a bit of a rough edge, was heading back from a stakeout that had just been called off. He was stopped at a red light on Ventura Boulevard when a green SUV pulled up next to him blasting rap music. Liga glanced over and locked eyes with the driver, a bald, intense-looking black man who was giving him a hard stare. Trying to defuse the situation, Liga rolled down his window and asked if there was a problem. But instead of cooling off, the driver snapped back aggressively. From the way he carried himself, Liga immediately pegged him as a gang member. Later, he'd recall, "This guy had 'I'm a gang member' written all over him." Things escalated fast. The man in the SUV dared Liga to pull over and settle it. Liga acted like he would, but didn't follow through, which only made the other driver angrier. The guy weaved through traffic, chasing Liga down, and before long, both of them were reaching for their guns. Liga, seeing the other guy going for a weapon, fired first. Then, in a panic, he radioed in, "I just shot this guy, I need help. Get up here." The driver managed to pull into a gas station, but by the time backup showed up, he was already gone. And when they checked his ID, turns out he wasn't just some random guy. He was Kevin Gaines, an LAPD officer. At first, it seemed like just another road rage incident, but things got weird fast. Gaines had a history of violent outbursts, including domestic abuse complaints and even a past road rage case where he threatened to cap someone. But what really didn't add up? His lifestyle. For a regular cop, he was living big. Designer suits, stacks of cash, a Mercedes. Then came the real shocker. The SUV wasn't even his. It belonged to Sharitha Knight, Suge Knight's estranged wife. And if that wasn't shady enough, detectives found a receipt showing Gaines had just dropped $952 at Monty's Steakhouse, a known death row hangout. That set off alarms. Detective Russell Poole started hearing whispers about off-duty cops working for death row and making serious cash. The deeper he dug, the sketchier it got, so much so that he even wondered if dirty cops were tied to Biggie's Emder. But in the end, nothing stuck. Then, just months later, things got even wilder. On November 6, 1997, two armed robbers hit a Bank of America in LA. Pulling off a heist straight out of a movie, they made off with $722,000, just 10 minutes after a fresh cash drop. Cops immediately suspected an inside job, and all eyes landed on assistant bank manager Erilyn Romero. The timing was too perfect. Under pressure, she cracked and dropped a bombshell. She was in on it, and her boyfriend? None other than LAPD officer David Mack. On the outside, David Mack looked like a stand-up guy. Married, kids, steady job as an LAPD officer. But when investigators started grilling him about the bank robbery, he completely shut down. He refused to give up the names of his accomplices, wouldn't say a word about where the money went, and basically acted like he had nothing to do with it. His silence cost him big, 14 years in federal prison. And once he was behind bars, he ditched the whole cop act and went all in with the mob Piru Bloods, a gang with strong ties to death row records. But the story didn't end there. When investigators dug deeper into Mack's past, they found something really interesting. Just 2 days after the bank heist, he took a trip to Las Vegas. And guess who was with him? None other than Rafael Perez. That little connection would end up blowing the lid off one of the biggest police corruption scandals in history. Fast forward to August 25th, 1998. The law finally caught up with Perez. SWAT teams stormed his quiet suburban neighborhood, arresting him for stealing nearly $1 million worth of coke straight from an LAPD evidence locker. Turns out, Perez had checked out the drugs under a fake name, and when his fellow officers started looking into it, the whole thing unraveled fast. Facing up to 12 years in prison, Perez did what a lot of criminals do when they get caught. He made a deal. In exchange for immunity, he agreed to tell all about the dirty secrets inside the LAPD's Rampart division. Over the course of 35 intense interviews, he exposed a shocking level of corruption. He described how officers planted fake evidence to lock people up, beat suspects for no reason, covered for each other when things got messy, and even straight up threatened or framed anyone who tried to call them out. In some cases, cops even plotted to under suspects.
Rafael Perez snitched on 70 co-workers that he did dirt with. 70 of them.
Perez's confessions were so massive they filled 4,500 pages of testimony. But the most jaw-dropping revelation? The story of Javier Ovando, a gang member who had been shot 3 times and paralyzed by Perez and his partner during a stakeout. Perez admitted that the entire case against Ovando was a lie. He and his partner, Nino Durden, had found Ovando and a few others hiding in an abandoned building. After questioning the group and letting the others go, they kept Ovando behind. And then out of nowhere, Durden shot him while he was handcuffed and unarmed. To cover it up, they planted a gun next to him and made up a story about how Ovando had attacked them.
The most dramatic case to come to light is that of Javier Francisco Ovando. He spent nearly 3 years in prison before prosecutors discovered he'd been framed.
The worst part? Ovando actually survived. But instead of getting justice, he got 23 years in prison after Perez and Durden took the stand and lied, painting him as some ruthless gang assassin who had tried to off them. Ovando barely spoke English, had no way to properly defend himself, and was completely powerless against the system.
Why do you think the police shot you?
I don't know.
Had you seen Perez, Durden before?
His desperate attempts to claim his innocence were ignored, because after all, who would believe a gang member over a decorated cop? By the time Rafael Perez was done spilling secrets, 70 LAPD officers were under investigation.
In 1999, 70 police officers were accused of police misconduct during the LAPD's infamous Rampart scandal. And the man behind it all was Rafael Perez.
The fallout was huge. Over 100 wrongful convictions were overturned, and the city of LA had to cough up $125 million in lawsuit payouts. Some victims got as little as $25,000, while Javier Ovando, the poster child of LAPD corruption, walked away with $15 million. Locals even started calling it the Rampart lottery because so many people were cashing in. But when investigators tried to dig deeper into Perez's claims, things got tricky. Nearly every officer he accused denied everything, and not a single cop backed up his story. Out of the 70 he named, only 9 were prosecuted, and 24 either quit or got fired. And despite all the dirt he dished, Perez conveniently never mentioned his old partner, David Mack. He also stayed quiet about some major topics: Biggie Smalls' Emder, the bank heist, and any real links to death row records, making people question how much of his story was the truth. One thing was certain though, Suge Knight had plenty of off-duty LAPD officers working for him, and guys like Perez, Kevin Gaines, and David Mack all had suspicious ties.
He's making excuses because he knew that if David Mack is at the scene, David Mack has something to do with it. If David Mack sends Rafael Perez for being there, Rafael Perez has something to do with it.
But without solid proof, the deeper conspiracy theories remained just that, theories. What was clear was that the LAPD had to clean house. The crash unit was completely shut down. Gang officers were required to wear standard uniforms, and the Department of Justice put the entire department under 5 years of federal oversight. During his trial, prosecutors painted Perez as a dirty cop who went rogue, running with LA gangsters and bending the law to suit himself. He admitted to being corrupt, but claimed he never fully grasped the damage he was doing. He insisted he was just trying to clean up the streets, his way. In court, he even apologized. Back in 2001, at just 33, Perez walked free after doing only 3 years of a 5-year sentence for stealing from the evidence locker. Later that year, he admitted to shooting Javier Ovando and got 5 more years, but he was out in 2 on parole. In the end, his testimony got him full immunity for everything else he did as a cop. These days, the Rampart division looks nothing like it did back then. The station moved, and officials swear the department's been cleaned up. Some folks believe it. Others say the LAPD still has a lot to prove. As for Perez, he's been off the radar since his release, avoiding interviews and staying out of the spotlight. But no matter how quiet he keeps, his name will always be tied to one of the biggest police corruption scandals in California history.